Hi there, thanks for joining me. In this video, we're going to take a look at layer order. Layer order is an important thing to understand and master because using layers can either help you or it can make your life a lot harder when you're trying to create a painting. So what layers are essentially individual pieces of artwork that you can stack on top of each other. You could think of them like maybe cut out pieces of paper where you could have one on top of the other and you could change the order of them. So what we have here is a canvas where we have two dimensions. We have the horizontal and the vertical axis, which creates two dimensions that we can draw on, but we also have this layers palette, which is the third dimension, which is coming at us or going away from us visually. So we have three dimensions that we can work with here. Up here, the top end is what's closer to you, and what's down here at the bottom end is what's far away. So if you were standing here on top of the layers palette, you'd be standing here at the very top and you'd be looking down through all of these layers. So if this is you and you're looking through all of these layers, this is the bottom most layer and this is the top. And we have these flower and tree icon things up here, as you can see. And these are stacked facing us right now in the layer order. So take the blue flower first and we'll take a look. It's on its own layer. We can move this layer around and it's always going to be on top of the red tree and the pine tree. However, if we change the order of the layers and we drag this layer down and we put it behind the maple, it's going to go further away from us, so it's going to get covered up by the maple. So we move the flower down below the maple layer in the layers palette and it goes behind the maple visually. Now we can't even see it at all, but if we move it to the left or to the right, we can see that it's back there. Now if we wanted to, we could move the pine tree in front of everything. We can drag it up above the maple layer in the layer order, and now it's covering everything. If we move it to the left and to the right, we can see everything is behind it. So you might ask yourself now, what's the point of using layers? Well, the main point is that this is digital art. This isn't oil paint or pastel or colored pencil. So there are layers available to you. You're supposed to use them. You don't have to, but you know, it's part of the fun of working with this medium. It would be like working with watercolors and not using a brush and just squeezing the tubes of paint onto a canvas to make a watercolor painting. Although it would be very avant-garde, it might not be as fulfilling or fun as using some brushes and some water to make a watercolor painting. So they're here to be used, and they'll make your life a lot easier and make it, it'll help you make some more creative decisions too. So what made me think of doing this video is I just recently was working with one of my students here in Seattle, and he's really new to digital painting and he didn't quite understand the layer order thing. So he was just kind of working on a painting in his spare time, and I noticed that when I looked at it, he had this background layer which was some dirt, and what he had done is he'd used the airbrush and he went in and, let's do it to this pine tree, he went in and really carefully tried to paint in along all of the edges to get a nice edge here and put in a background, because he'd drawn in a lot of the foreground stuff first, as I've done here with this pine tree. So he was working kind of from the foreground to the background, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that. What you have to watch out for is the order that these layers are in. If the object is in the foreground, the layers should be stacked in the foreground or closer to you. If the object's in the background, like this yellow background I'm putting in here, this should not be in the foreground. It should be behind the pine tree, because it is behind the pine tree in our composition, in our little world here, in our imagination. Our background isn't some cutout thing that's floating over our tree. So it doesn't make any sense to have your layers in that order, even if you do really want to paint up to this edge. And this really makes the most sense. Most people who work with pencils or traditional mediums would obviously think to go about this way, or to go about doing it this way, because they're not used to the digital medium and they're not used to layers. So if we are to use these layers properly, what we should do is we should make this background be behind the pine tree, and everything else, it should just be one of the bottommost layers. The reason why is that now if we want to paint in our background blue or any other color, we're not going to obscure our tree and paint over it, because our trees, all of these trees, are now all on their own layers, and those layers are in front of the background layer. So we can freely just go in and paint in our background over this whole thing, and you can see that all of these layers are not getting covered up because they're all their own independent layers. We've got our sketch here, and we've got some notes that I wrote down, all of this stuff. So you can really use this to your advantage when painting. So to clarify that, I'll make a new canvas here, and I'm just going to do a really quick, really fast, just kind of demo painting. So we're going to make a layer, and we'll call this our sky. So our sky is the furthest away from us in our composition. In my imagination, that's the furthest thing away from us. So there's our sky. Then the next thing that's furthest away in front of the sky are the clouds. So we'll put in some clouds. And then in front of these clouds, the next closest thing will be a mountain. We'll throw that in here. And in front of the mountain, closer to us, so at the top of the layers palette here, we're going to have some grass. And there you go. You can see, if I had done this in the other order, it really wouldn't make too much of a difference. However, generally speaking, it does kind of help you plot things out a little better if you try to think about and you try to imagine what would be in the background first and account for that. That doesn't mean that you couldn't have painted the grass first. It would be fine to paint the grass first or the mountain first. It kind of depends on what you're painting. We could have, for instance, a little person here in our painting. We'll call it artist, and we'll just make a little stick figure here with super long arms, and we can have them here. And then if we wanted to, for some reason, put something in front of the artist, or in between the artist and the grass, we can still do that. Let's say maybe there's going to be a lake or something here. We want to put it in, whoops. We want to put it in, of course the layer order is wrong here, so I'll just fix this and drag it below the artist, and there you go. So you can do things in the foreground before you do what's in the background, and that's fine. Again, it really depends on what you're painting, but you want to really be certain that if it's further away in your composition, in the world that you're painting here, it needs to be at the bottom of this layer palette here. So sky is the furthest away from us, and the artist is the closest thing to us. Now, I also want to say that there will be some exceptions. For instance, if you're doing something with line art that has ink, and your ink is going to be the topmost layer and cover up all of your color, then whether you're painting something in the foreground or in the background, your ink is going to be the topmost layer, or you want your ink to at least be covering up the color that's supposed to be behind it. So let's say this is our ink here, and we're going to put some color on a layer behind it. Even if this tree is in the background and the person is in the foreground, the ink for both the tree and the person are going to be the topmost layer because we want the ink to cover everything. So don't take that what I said earlier of foreground and background too literally, because you have to kind of use your judgment there. You may want to, in some cases, add supplemental layers on top of everything, like a tint or a highlight. So for instance, maybe I want to put a white highlight on the eyes, and I want it to be above the ink layer. I can do that here. And there you go, we have a supplemental layer. Now whether or not this character here ends up being in the foreground or the background is again going to kind of depend on how you're putting your composition together. These layers can also be grouped, and if you want to learn more about layers, I have a special video dedicated to the ins and outs of how to use layers and all the little tricks. I'll post a link for that in the description to this video. One more thing to note, there are different opacity settings for these brushes, and so far I've been using a brush that's 100% opaque, so when you put down paint, you can't see through to any of the paint behind it. So let's say, like for instance, I put just a big yellow streak across this now. You can't see anything behind it because this brush is set to paint at 100% opacity. And opacity is the amount that you can see through your paint or your layer. And each layer has its own opacity setting. So if I wanted this yellow to be more see-through, I could change the opacity to 45, and now it's about half transparent. And if I change it to 0, it's essentially invisible. So you have to watch out for this opacity, because if we're doing something like painting with an airbrush at a low opacity, and we do something like this, where we paint in some background here, and we think that we got everything nice and yellow here and it looks good. Then we make another layer and we start painting in some blue, and that blends nicely. Well, you might have some issues where if you go back to a layer underneath and you start painting on it, all of a sudden you can see through, and you're probably wondering why. Well, it's blue here. Why is me painting with dark blue on the yellow layer turning it this blue color? Because this blue color here that you see is not this color here that you see sampled. It's clearly a different color. So why is this happening? Well, this is because this top layer, this blue layer, is semi-transparent. So if we turn off this background layer, you'll see this checkered thing, and this isn't a giant chessboard. What it is it's showing you transparency. So this checkerboard represents absolutely nothing. You can think of it like invisible, so there's nothing there. So if you can see this checkerboard pattern, you know that you're seeing transparency. So right now we can see how transparent this blue is. If we turn the canvas back on, it's kind of hard to tell. But what's happening here is some of this blue is opaque. So that blue is covering up and lightening this dark area here. So you might run into this issue where if you're creating a bunch of different layers and you're painting on them, but you're painting with a low opacity brush, and you're doing something in the foreground, if you go back to the background and you start doing something you might not get the color that you think you're going to get because you're painting here on this layer with this yellow, but you're getting orange and it's yellow over here. It starts to get really confusing. So you have to understand that layers can have different opacities. There's different opacity settings that you can do with the slider here, but the paint that you put down on each layer can have different levels of opacity also. So when I'm putting down flat colors and things, I generally use a fully opaque brush. However, if I'm doing like tinting or shading, I'll use an airbrush. But at all times, I'm fully aware of what's going on to that layer and how opaque it is and how it's going to blend with all the layers underneath. Now, if we wanted to do something like tint this whole layer, there's one more little critical feature of the layers, and that is the blend mode or the composite method. And what that does is that controls how one layer blends with all the layers below it. Because, for instance, if we wanted to tint this whole composition orange, for instance, and we go to use a brush that's opaque, we're going to cover up all the layers underneath. If we were to set the composite method to something else, like multiply, this will then tint the background rather than cover it up. So it's controlling how one layer blends with all the layers below it. Multiply basically just kind of tints and darkens. There's its opposite, which is screen, which lightens everything. So if we set it to screen, you can see it gets washed out. There's another video that I've done that goes really extensively into how layers work, and it'll show you all the little tips and tricks to do all this stuff and how to use these blend modes. But I wanted to keep this particular video just kind of concise and focus more on the importance of layer orders. So hopefully this was helpful for you. If you have any other questions, feel free to just leave a comment on this video and I'll try to get back to you with an answer. And if you found this information helpful, please take a second to like this video or share it, and it'll make it easier for other artists out there to find it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.